It was just past sunset when the orphaned teacher wandered down to the riverbank. Her shoes were thin, her coat borrowed, and her name, Miss Eliza Ray, was barely known in that town. She had come west with hope, carrying a small suitcase and a teaching certificate no one had bothered to verify. The school board never replied. The post office never called her name. And every door she knocked on offered her only pity, if not silence. In a town built on coal dust and cattle blood, nobody had room for a soft-spoken woman with trembling hands and no family name. That river, wide and slow, didn't judge her. It didn't care that her stockings had holes or that her lesson plans were folded neatly in a satchel. She hadn't opened in weeks. The river just moved, as if carrying the weight of the forgotten with it. That's why Eliza came there every evening, because the current never asked for proof of who she was. That day, her hunger had become something louder than her thoughts. She hadn't eaten since Tuesday. Her stomach ached in waves. And when she sat beside the water, the cold stones beneath her felt like home, hard and unmoving. No one noticed her at the edge of the world. The town's laughter stayed far behind her. But someone had noticed. He had noticed for days. Behind her, not too close, stood a man who didn't speak much. Folks called him the silent cowboy. Some said he'd been shot in the throat during a bar fight in Arizona. Others whispered he just chose not to speak after losing everyone he ever loved. But he watched from a distance, never disturbing her grief. Until today. Today, something about the way she slumped, shoulders folding in like the last page of a book, made him take a step forward. Eliza didn't hear his boots crunch the dirt. The river had a way of swallowing sound. Her head was bowed, face hidden beneath tangled curls and the weight of too many yesterdays. Her fingers clutched a folded letter, creased, faded, and cruel. It was her final rejection from the district. No openings, no pay, no explanation. Her last hope gone. She didn't want to cry, but her body had no strength left to pretend. And so the tears came, silent and slow, just like the river. Her shoulders trembled, but the world didn't pause. The wind moved through the grass. A crow flew overhead. Life went on, indifferent. Then, something interrupted her sadness. Not a sound, but a presence. A shadow stretched beside hers. A boot came into view. Then another. Slowly, quietly. She stiffened, ready to run or be shamed. But what followed wasn't cruelty. It wasn't pity. It was a hand. Rough, weathered, sun-darkened. The kind of hand that knew work and war and wilderness. It hovered there beside her like a branch in the storm, steady, patient, without pressure. It didn't pull. It didn't demand. It simply offered. And somehow, that meant everything. Eliza stared at it, then up at him. He didn't speak. His eyes held the same color as the distant hills, cold at first glance, but warm when held too long. There was no explanation in them, just a knowing, a gentleness that didn't fit his size or silence. She placed her hand in his. He helped her up, not forcefully, not urgently, but as if lifting something precious from the ground. She rose with him, legs weak but soul steadied. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel invisible. They stood side by side, two strangers with too many secrets. No introductions, no promises, just a shared stillness. And when he turned to walk, she followed. Not out of fear, not out of debt, but because his silence didn't scare her, it comforted her. She didn't know where they were going. He didn't ask where she came from. And maybe, for once, that was exactly what she needed. The path they walked was narrow, the kind only deer remembered and dust respected. The sun had dipped behind the hills, leaving behind a sky smeared with lavender and ash. Eliza's legs moved on their own, her mind still numb from the moment she took his hand. The cowboy stayed just ahead, his stride steady, boots whispering against dry earth. He never looked back, but he never walked too far either. He knew she was tired, knew she was scared, and still, he led without question. After what felt like hours, they reached it, a small cabin tucked against the trees, half hidden by wild shrubs and vines. Its wood was old, grayed by storms and years, but the windows glowed gold from within. Smoke curled gently from the chimney, and a horse neighed softly behind the stable nearby. Everything about the place felt like it didn't want to be found, and that's what made it safe. The cowboy opened the door and stepped aside. No gesture, no explanation, just space for her. Inside, warmth wrapped around her like a blanket. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. A stew pot hissed with something simple but rich. There were books stacked in uneven towers, a worn armchair by the window, and an old coat hanging on the wall with bullet holes neatly patched. Everything was humble, yet nothing felt broken. Eliza stood by the fire, not daring to sit. Her eyes welled again, not from hunger or sorrow this time, but something harder to name. Maybe relief. Maybe disbelief that kindness still existed. The cowboy moved quietly. He ladled a bowl of stew, placed it on the wooden table, and walked away, not to watch her eat, not to expect thanks, just to give her space. She sat, ate, slowly, as if her body needed to remember how. She glanced at him once more. He'd taken off his hat, leaned against the doorway with arms crossed, eyes closed. Not asleep, just still. And in that silence, something healed. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the crooked window pane like warm honey. Eliza woke on a cot beside the fireplace, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled faintly of pine and smoke. For the first time in weeks, she had slept without fear. No distant trains, no angry landlords, no school rejection letters haunting her dreams. Only the crackle of coals and the quiet breath of dawn. The cowboy was already outside, splitting logs with rhythmic strikes that echoed through the trees. She watched him from the doorframe, unsure if stepping outside would break the fragile peace between them. But he glanced back once, just once, and it was enough to say she was welcome. She stepped out, bare feet meeting cool wooden planks. The air smelled of sap and river fog. Somewhere nearby, birds practiced their morning songs. He nodded toward a chair. She sat. No words. No need. They ate biscuits and dried apples on the porch. He poured her coffee from a battered kettle, and she sipped slowly, wondering when the last time someone had poured anything for her, without asking something in return. But peace rarely stays long in this world, not for folks like her. A rickety wagon appeared on the distant trail, pulled by two horses and covered in dust. A man in a brown suit sat at the front, and even from afar, Eliza recognized the posture of authority. Behind him, two other men followed on horseback, rough-faced and smug. They weren't from the town. No, these men were worse. Government men. The kind that came with ledgers and letters that could end dreams. Eliza froze. She clutched her satchel tight, heart racing. Had they come for her? Had someone written lies? Or worse, truths? The cowboy stood, quiet as always, but his eyes narrowed. His body shifted, not in fear, but readiness. Like a wolf standing guard over its pack. The wagon rolled closer. Dust clouds rose like ghosts behind them. And in that moment, the peaceful porch became a battlefield with no bullets, only silence, steady hands, and unspoken truths. The wagon stopped just beyond the fence line. Dust settled slowly, like judgment from the heavens. The man in the brown suit adjusted his collar, glanced at the two riders behind him, then stepped down with a careful dignity that smelled like paperwork and power. He pulled out a folded letter and approached. The porch like he owned the ground he walked on. Eliza stood, hands clenched tight around the handle of her satchel. She had no idea what was written in that letter, but her body remembered enough heartache to know trouble when it wore polished shoes. The man tipped his hat without smiling, and without a word, held out the letter. The cowboy didn't reach for it. He just stared, still as a mountain. So the man turned and handed it to Eliza. Her fingers shook as she unfolded the paper. The words struck like cold rain, a foreclosure notice. The schoolhouse she'd been hired to teach in was gone. Shut down, sold off, and tied to her name because they had never processed her resignation. The town had blamed her for abandoning the children, never knowing the district had buried her letter of acceptance. Now, she was marked as the one who failed them. Tears filled her eyes again, but not from sadness this time. From anger, betrayal, exhaustion. The man waited, expecting something. An apology, an explanation, maybe even a bribe. But he got nothing. Only silence and the steady presence of the cowboy beside her. And then it happened. The cowboy stepped forward. Slow, deliberate. He didn't take the letter. He didn't speak. He simply reached into his coat and pulled out a leather-bound journal. Inside it were deeds, maps, signatures, quiet proof of ownership that said more than any speech ever could. He handed the journal to the man in the suit. The man's brows furrowed. He read, flipped pages, then stiffened. This land, this cabin, this ridge overlooking the river, It all belonged to the cowboy. And more than that, so did the deed to the school. After the government men left, heads lowered, egos bruised, Eliza stood frozen by the railing, heart pounding in a rhythm she didn't understand. The cowboy had said nothing through it all, not a whisper. Yet somehow, he had spoken the loudest. Later that evening, after the fire crackled low and the stars settled in the sky, Eliza sat alone at the edge of the porch steps. She held the letter in one hand, the journal in the other. Page after page, she uncovered pieces of him. Land deeds, receipts for construction lumber, donations made anonymously to the school district. All signed in that quiet, slanted handwriting, Jacob M. Hollis. Her eyes widened. That name wasn't unfamiliar. In fact, she had read it before. Every teacher sent west had studied it. It was carved into a brass plate nailed above the main door of the very schoolhouse she had hoped to teach in. Hollis School for Frontier Learning. She had assumed it was just a name, just a donor from the past. But the donor was here, splitting wood, watching sunsets, eating apples in silence. He wasn't just the owner of the land. He was the man who had built the very place she thought she'd been denied. And now, without words, he had given it back to her. Her chest tightened with emotion she didn't know how to hold. Not gratitude. Not yet. But something deeper. Respect. Recognition. Two people. Both orphaned by fate. Both shaped by silence. Now sitting beside each other with nothing left to hide. He stepped onto the porch again, carrying an old wooden box. Inside was the original bell from the schoolhouse. Tarnished, chipped, but still solid. He placed it gently beside her, then turned and walked to the barn, leaving her alone with the sound of her future waiting to ring again. She reached out, touched the handle, and for a moment, she imagined children laughing. She saw the walls of the school repainted, books stacked, desks filled, a classroom not lost, but paused. And now, she had the power to restart it. The next day came with a strange stillness, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Eliza woke before dawn and walked out into the field behind the cabin. The bell from the schoolhouse sat quietly on the porch, waiting to be heard again. Her hands trembled as she picked it up and rang it once, soft, slow. The sound traveled across the hills like a memory returning home. By afternoon, she began clearing the old desks stored in the barn. Dusty, broken, forgotten, just like she'd felt. But she cleaned each one, stacking them with care, preparing for what hadn't yet been promised. And the cowboy, Jacob, helped in silence, moving wood, sorting planks, repairing windows with the calm skill of a man who'd rebuilt more than buildings. But as the sun fell low, something shifted. A horse galloped in the distance, fast, urgent. Then another. Soon, 3 riders approached the ridge, kicking up wind and worry. They weren't government men this time. These were rougher, mercenaries, hired hands. The kind of men who took what they wanted and answered to no one. They rode like fire was chasing them, or like they were chasing something else. Jacob saw them first and stopped. His jaw clenched, his hand brushed the inside of his coat, and his eyes narrowed with a storm Eliza hadn't seen before. She stepped closer, but he gently motioned for her to stay back. The lead rider dismounted before the cabin, scarred face, one eye, a long rifle slung over his shoulder. He spat on the ground, scanned the property, then looked Jacob straight in the eye. Eliza didn't know who he was, but Jacob did, and by the way his shoulders stiffened and his body shifted, she knew this man wasn't just a visitor. He was a ghost from a time before silence. The man said nothing, just stared, then nodded once, slow and bitter, before turning and riding off with his men into the darkness. Jacob didn't move for a long time after they left, and Eliza, standing behind him, suddenly realized something. Some paths don't knock. They ride in and wait for the right moment to strike. Night fell hard and heavy, thicker than usual. The silence between Eliza and Jacob stretched across the porch like a taut rope. She didn't ask questions. He didn't offer answers. But both knew the past had come to collect something, and it hadn't finished yet. That same night, the riders returned. This time they didn't dismount. They circled the cabin like vultures, slow and deliberate. The man with one eye raised his rifle, but didn't aim. Not yet. It was a warning, a memory with a trigger. Eliza stood behind Jacob, barefoot, holding nothing but the school bell in her hands. Jacob stepped down from the porch. Alone. He didn't flinch. Didn't reach for the revolver at his side. just looked that one-eyed man dead in what was left of his soul. Eliza didn't know why they were there, but Jacob did. Years ago, he had once ridden with them, not as a friend, but as a man who had to survive. Before the school, before the silence, before he chose peace over pride. But you don't just leave men like that. Not without them following. The one-eyed man spat again. He raised his rifle slowly. And then, the bell rang. Eliza stepped forward and rang it again. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound echoed through the valley like a sermon, sharp, defiant, and clear. The same bell that used to call children to learn was now calling a cowboy back to life. The riders hesitated, just long enough. Jacob's hand moved like lightning. His revolver spoke once. The rifle clattered to the ground. Horses reared. Dust flew. The others scattered without a fight. Not because they feared him, but because they feared what silence had turned him into. Eliza stood frozen, bell still in hand. Jacob turned, holstered his gun, and walked back up the porch. No victory, no smile, just a long breath, and then his hand reached out again. She took it, not out of fear, not out of debt, but out of something they had both earned, trust. By morning, they raised the school bell atop the rebuilt frame. It wasn't just a building now. It was a beginning.